The whispers of the lost. The city lights flickered in the rearview mirror as Keanu Reeves drove down the empty highway. The long hours on set had left him drained, his muscles aching from the day's relentless filming. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, sighing as the neon glow of the night blurred through his windshield. It had been one of those days where exhaustion pressed into his bones and hunger gnawed at his stomach. His friend Jake had just sent a message, postponing their planned meetup. That left Keanu alone with his thoughts, something he never truly minded. But tonight, he craved something simple, something grounding. Then he spotted it, the golden arches glowing in the distance. McDonald's. It was a mundane choice, but right now, it seemed perfect. Keanu pulled into the nearly deserted parking lot, his tires crunching over loose gravel. He parked near the entrance, stretching his arms over his head before stepping out of the car. The cold air hit his skin, a stark contrast to the stifling warmth of the trailer he had been holed up in all day. With slow steps, he walked inside, the scent of fried food and freshly brewed coffee greeting him. The restaurant was quiet, save for the occasional chatter of a few late-night patrons. A couple sat in the corner, laughing softly over their fries. A man in a wrinkled suit stared at his phone, barely touching his meal. A teenager, likely an employee off-duty, absent-mindedly scrolled through social media. Keanu approached the self-service kiosk, navigating the touchscreen with practiced ease. A simple meal, a cheeseburger, fries, and black coffee. He swiped his card, pocketed the receipt, and turned to find a seat. He chose a booth near the back, away from the few other customers. Sitting down, he let his body relax against the cushioned seat, taking a deep breath. The quiet hum of the restaurant lulled him into a temporary peace. Then, movement caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another customer walking past. But as he focused, he saw them. Two little girls. They were small, fragile-looking, no older than 10 or 11. Their identical yellow dresses were slightly tattered, their hair tangled yet neatly parted into two braids. They moved in tandem, their hands outstretched in silent plea. Keanu watched as they approached a table where an older man sat. The twins spoke softly, but whatever they said made the man frown. He shook his head, waved them away, and turned back to his meal. Undeterred, they moved to another table. A woman in a tailored blazer glanced at them, her lips curling in irritation before she pointedly ignored them. A group of teenagers at another table barely spared them a glance. A man in work overalls muttered something under his breath and shooed them off. Keanu's grip tightened around the edge of the table. What were they asking for? More importantly, why was no one helping them? What disturbed him even more was the reaction of the staff. The employees behind the counter didn't even acknowledge the twins' presence. No warning, no intervention. It was as if they were invisible. Keanu sat forward, his jaw tightening as the girls continued their silent journey from table to table, facing rejection after rejection. There was no frustration in their expressions, no tears, just quiet resignation. Then they turned toward him. Keanu held his breath as they approached. Standing before his booth, the twins lifted their gaze to meet his. Their eyes, dark and knowing, sent a chill down his spine. The girl on the left spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Help us." Her twin echoed her words in perfect synchronization. "Please." Keanu's heart clenched. He had heard desperation before. He had seen suffering, but this was different. This wasn't just hunger. This was fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could respond, the air shifted. The restaurant suddenly felt colder. A flickering light above them cast eerie shadows across their faces. Something was wrong. Then the girl on the right leaned in closer and whispered something into his ear, and Keanu Reeves felt his entire world shatter. Echoes in the silence. Chills slithered down Keanu's spine as the whispered words sank into his consciousness, their weight settling deep in the marrow of his bones. His breath hitched, his fingers curling involuntarily against the cool surface of the table. The restaurant's low hum of idle conversation and the occasional beep of the kitchen equipment faded into a distant, almost ethereal backdrop. The world around him dimmed, his focus narrowing to the two identical figures standing before him. The twin girls, dressed in wrinkled yellow dresses that once must have been vibrant, now stood eerily still, their dark, wide eyes locked onto his. They exuded an unnatural calmness, an unsettling composure that seemed beyond their young years. For the briefest moment, Keanu questioned if they were even real. The way they moved, the synchrony of their presence, it felt off, almost otherworldly. But he could feel the whisper still lingering against his skin, the warmth of their breath-carrying words that had pierced through the walls of his mind like a dagger through silk. "Help us, please." Those had been the first words, simple, yet heavy. But it was what came next, the words spoken by the second twin, that shook him. She had leaned in, her voice softer than a dying breeze, and uttered a sentence that made his pulse pound against his temples. "They don't see us, but you do." His throat tightened. The weight of their words crashed over him like a tidal wave, forcing him into a moment of paralysis. He tore his gaze away from them, looking around the restaurant as if to confirm the absurdity of what they had said. He scanned the room, searching the faces of the other customers. The employees, the exhausted night shift workers pouring coffee into disposable cups. No one was looking at the girls. No one was acknowledging them. No one had acknowledged them. His mind replayed the moments he had observed before, the dismissive glances, the way people turned their backs, their expressions ranging from annoyance to sheer indifference. But now, as he looked closer, it wasn't just avoidance. It was complete unawareness. The twins weren't being ignored. They were being overlooked. Keanu's stomach twisted in knots. His breathing shallowed. The twins were still standing there, patiently waiting, their expressions unreadable yet filled with something close to expectation. It was as if they had done this before, approached someone, whispered their desperate plea, and waited to see if they could be heard. His rational mind struggled against the creeping realization slithering up his spine. Maybe they were just street kids, two unfortunate souls abandoned to fend for themselves, left invisible by a world too preoccupied with its own distractions. But something about them didn't align with that logic. Their presence was too strange, too deliberate. Swallowing thickly, Keanu finally found his voice, though it felt foreign in his throat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his words careful, edged with a cautious curiosity. The twins exchanged a glance, their small faces unreadable. Then the girl on the left spoke again, her voice steady yet hauntingly soft. "They don't see us," she repeated. "But you do." A shudder rippled through Keanu's body. He had been in surreal situations before, on film sets, in immersive roles, in personal experiences that blurred the line between reality and the inexplicable. But this was something else entirely. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to brush this off as exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But he didn't. Instead, he asked, "Why me?" Neither twin answered immediately. They only stared at him, their wide, haunting eyes unblinking. The restaurant's dim lighting cast elongated shadows on their faces, making them appear even more spectral. Then the second girl spoke again, "Because you listen." The words settled into the pit of his stomach like cold lead. Keanu was no stranger to people who needed help. He had spent years quietly assisting those in need, donating to charities, offering kindness to strangers without expecting anything in return. He believed in the power of empathy, in the quiet strength of helping without seeking recognition. But this felt like something beyond his realm of experience. The tension in the air thickened. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, buzzing loudly before returning to their steady glow. Keanu let out a slow breath, forcing himself to push past the unease coiling in his chest. He studied the girls closely now. Their identical features, their too perfect synchrony, The faded stains on their dresses, the way their hair, despite its disheveled state, still retained a semblance of careful parting, as if someone, once upon a time, had ensured they were well kept. He didn't know why, but something inside him cracked. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The twins blinked in unison. Then, for the first time, a flicker of something, relief, passed across their faces, but they didn't answer. Instead, they both slowly turned their heads, looking toward the restaurant's glass entrance. Keanu followed their gaze, his brows furrowing. The parking lot outside was dimly lit, the occasional passing car casting streaks of light across the pavement. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No approaching figure, no looming danger, just the quiet night stretching beyond the glass. Still, the twins remained focused on something out there. Unease slithered into Keanu's gut. He shifted in his seat, his heartbeat quickening for reasons he couldn't quite define. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl on the right turned back to him first. This time, her eyes weren't just filled with quiet desperation. They were filled with fear. "He's coming," she whispered. Keanu felt an invisible grip tighten around his chest. "Who?" he asked, his voice instinctively lower, as if speaking too loudly might somehow invite whatever she was afraid of. The other twin finally turned back to him as well. Their small hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles paling. "A man in the black coat," she murmured. "He always finds us." A heavy silence fell between them, stretching unbearably long. Keanu felt his pulse in his throat, a steady drum of unease. He cast another glance at the entrance, at the stillness of the parking lot beyond. The night remained undisturbed. And yet, he could feel something shift in the atmosphere, a creeping sensation, like the air had grown heavier, colder. The twins moved suddenly. In perfect unison, they slid into the booth, one sitting across from him, the other beside him. Their small hands, cold as marble, pressed against his forearm. "Please," one of them whispered, "don't let him take us." Keanu's breath caught in his throat. Somewhere in the distance, just beyond the restaurant's glass doors, the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the night. The man in the black coat. The air inside the McDonald's seemed to shift, growing heavier, as if an unseen weight pressed against the very walls of the building. Keanu sat frozen in the booth, his pulse pounding beneath his skin. The small, cold hands of the twin girls gripped his forearm tightly, their touch sending a shiver up his spine. Outside, beyond the glass doors, the night stretched in eerie silence, but the distant echo of footsteps cut through it like a whisper of something unseen. He forced himself to swallow, his throat dry. "Who is he?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the unease clawing at his gut. The girls didn't answer immediately, only exchanging another one of those unreadable glances between them. The one sitting beside him tightened her grip slightly, as if grounding herself in his presence. "He follows us," the girl across from him finally whispered. "Everywhere we go. He waits." Keanu glanced toward the entrance, his body tensing. There was no one there, at least not yet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something lurked just beyond the veil of the ordinary. Something patient, something watching. The younger of the two twins, the one who had spoken first when they approached him, lowered her gaze to the table. "Most people don't see us," she said, her voice barely above a breath. "They don't hear us." She hesitated before looking back up at him, her dark eyes filled with something heavy. "But he does." Keanu felt a cold dread coil in his stomach. The weight of their words settled deep, anchoring him to the moment in a way that felt unnatural. He had always prided himself on being attuned to people, to the energy they carried, to the quiet burdens they bore. But this was different. A sudden gust of wind rattled the glass doors. The overhead lights flickered again, casting brief, unsettling shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. A quiet hush fell over the restaurant, as if something unseen had pressed pause on the world for a split second. Even the usual sounds, the rustling of wrappers, the hum of the fryer, the quiet murmur of conversations, seemed to dull, fading into the background like echoes from another reality. Then the bell above the door chimed. Keanu's breath hitched. A figure stepped inside. The twins tensed immediately, their hands slipping from his arm as they pressed themselves further into the booth. The one beside him gripped the fabric of his sleeve, her small fingers trembling slightly. Keanu forced himself to look. The man who had just entered was tall, unnaturally so. He wore a long, heavy black coat that trailed just above the floor, its edges slightly tattered as if worn down by time itself. His posture was unnervingly stiff, his movements too controlled, too precise. But what unsettled Keanu the most was his face, or rather, the lack of it. The man's skin was impossibly smooth, devoid of any distinguishing features, no wrinkles, no imperfections, nothing. His eyes, deep-set and impossibly dark, were the only things that held any semblance of expression, though even that was unreadable. They were hollow, bottomless, like staring into the depths of a starless night. Keanu's heart slammed against his ribs. The figure moved slowly, methodically, scanning the restaurant as if searching for something or someone. The other customers didn't react. They continued eating, talking, scrolling through their phones, completely oblivious to the presence that had just entered the room. Even the employees behind the counter remained indifferent, their motions mechanical as they continued with their tasks. It was as if, to them, the man in the black coat simply did not exist. But the twins saw him, and so did Keanu. A cold sweat broke out along the back of his neck. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to move, to run, to get the hell out of there. But he remained seated, his breath coming in slow, measured inhales. Then the man turned his head. Their eyes met. Keanu felt a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced, a pressure, an invisible force pressing down on him, constricting his chest as if unseen hands were tightening around his lungs. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something ancient, something wrong. The man's lips, thin, pale, curled ever so slightly. A smile. Keanu knew, in that instant, that the man wasn't just looking at him. He was acknowledging him. The realization sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through his veins. This wasn't some hallucination, some figment of exhaustion warping his senses. This was real. The man in the black coat took a single step forward. The twins flinched. Keanu instinctively shifted in his seat, placing himself slightly in front of them, his protective instincts overriding the logical part of his mind that told him this isn't your fight, walk away. But something inside him refused to move. The air grew heavier. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered again, buzzing louder this time. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop by several degrees, the cold seeping into his skin. Then, just as suddenly as he had arrived, the man in the black coat stopped. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something unseen. A moment passed, a breath, a pause in time, before his lips parted slightly, and he whispered something. The words never reached Keanu's ears, but they sent a violent shudder through the twins. The younger one clutched at his sleeve, her knuckles white. The older twin's breathing grew ragged, panic flickering behind her dark eyes. Then, without another word, the man turned around and walked out. The bell above the door chimed softly as the door swung shut behind him. The weight that had pressed against Keanu's chest lifted slightly, though the unease remained. The restaurant seemed to return to normal, the sounds of life trickling back in, as if the brief encounter had never happened. Customers continued eating. The employees continued working. No one had noticed. No one had reacted. Keanu turned to the twins. They were shaking. The one beside him exhaled a trembling breath before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's never left before." Keanu's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" The other twin, the one across from him, swallowed hard before answering. "He always takes us. A cold realization settled over him. This time, something had stopped him. Keanu felt the twins' small fingers tighten around his arm, their desperate grip grounding him to the moment. He had no idea what had just happened, no rational explanation for what he had just seen. But one thing was certain. The man in the black coat had left, and it had everything to do with Keanu. Shadows that follow. The silence that followed the man's departure was almost suffocating. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with peace, but the kind that signified something unnatural, a pause in reality itself. Keanu could feel it lingering in the air, like an echo of something that should never have existed. His body remained rigid, every muscle tense with the aftershock of what he had just experienced. He had been in dangerous situations before, on screen, and in real life. But this was different. This was something that didn't belong to this world. He turned his gaze toward the twin girls, their small bodies still trembling in the booth beside him. They weren't just scared. They were terrified. The kind of terror that came from knowing something inevitable, something inescapable. The younger twin clutched his sleeve so tightly that her fingers turned pale, while the older one gripped the edge of the table, as if grounding herself from falling into an abyss. Keanu inhaled deeply, forcing himself to steady his thoughts. "He's gone," he said, his voice softer than he intended, but firm enough to pull the girls out of their paralysis. They didn't answer immediately, their dark eyes still locked onto the entrance of the restaurant, as if expecting the man to step back in at any moment. But after a few heartbeats, the younger one, still holding onto him, finally spoke. "No," she whispered. "He's never gone. He's waiting." Keanu's stomach twisted at the certainty in her voice. He could hear the weight behind her words, the kind of knowledge that shouldn't belong to a child. Slowly, he glanced toward the glass doors again. The parking lot was still. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. There was no one there. But the feeling that something was still watching them remained. The older twin exhaled shakily, shifting in her seat as she turned toward Keanu with a newfound urgency in her expression. "You don't understand," she said, her voice edged with something between desperation and resignation. "No one ever stops him. Not until tonight." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The younger girl bit her lip, her fingers twitching against his sleeve. "We don't belong here. Not anymore." The words sent a chill through him. Keanu had been trying to rationalize the situation since it began, trying to fit what he had seen into something believable. But this was something else entirely. He was staring at two children who spoke in riddles, who claimed that a man in a black coat was hunting them, and who, by all appearances, were invisible to everyone but him. A quiet hum buzzed against the restaurant walls, as if the air itself was vibrating with something unseen. Keanu leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Tell me the truth. Who is he? And who are you?" The twins hesitated. Another glance passed between them. Something silent yet waited. It was as if they were debating whether or not to tell him, whether or not he could handle the truth. Then, finally, the older one spoke. "We died," she said. The words hit him like a truck. Keanu blinked, his breath caught somewhere in his chest. He stared at them, waiting for them to clarify, waiting for them to tell him they were kidding, mistaken, delusional, anything that made sense. But they didn't. The younger twin swallowed hard, her voice even softer than before. "A long time ago, a man took us. We tried to run, but we never made it." Keanu felt the air leave his lungs. His mind struggled to process what he had just heard, but something in his gut told him they weren't lying. He thought about the way no one else had reacted to them, the way the restaurant patrons had looked through them, as if they weren't there. The employees had ignored them, the customers had brushed them aside, not out of cruelty, but because they couldn't see them. The twins weren't invisible. They weren't alive. His body felt heavier now, the realization pressing down on him like a boulder. He had been speaking to ghosts. Keanu had always been open to the unknown, to the idea that there was more to the world than what the eye could see. He had encountered strange things in his life, things that defied logic, things that made him question reality. But this was something else. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "The man in the black coat, was he the one who took you?" The older twin nodded. Keanu clenched his jaw. A storm of emotions swirled inside him. Anger, sorrow, disbelief. He had spent his life playing heroes on screen, portraying characters who fought against evil, who saved the innocent. But now, sitting in a dimly lit McDonald's with two lost souls who had never been saved, he felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. "He takes others," the younger twin added, her voice barely audible. "We see them, the ones who don't escape." A sharp, cold realization sliced through Keanu's mind. If the man in the black coat was still here, still hunting, that meant he was still taking people. Keanu exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His fingers trembled slightly, but he forced himself to focus. "Why me?" he finally asked. "Why can I see you when no one else can?" This time, the older twin's gaze softened, not in fear, but in something close to gratitude. "Because you're different." He frowned. "Different how?" "You listen," the younger twin said, echoing the words she had spoken before. "You see people the way they need to be seen." A flicker of understanding passed through him. Keanu had always believed in kindness, in helping without expecting anything in return. But he had never thought that such a simple thing, truly seeing people, truly listening, would ever lead him here. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows again, making the twins flinch. "He's still watching," the older one whispered. "We need to go." Keanu nodded, his instincts kicking in. He didn't know what he was stepping into. But one thing was clear. He wasn't about to leave them alone. He stood up, guiding the twins toward the exit. They moved carefully, cautiously, their small hands clutching onto his jacket like lifelines. As they stepped outside, the cold night air hit them like a warning. The parking lot was empty, eerily still, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. Then, as they started toward his car, something shifted. Keanu felt it before he saw it. The sudden drop in temperature, the weight pressing down on his chest, like invisible hands. The twins froze beside him, their grip on his jacket tightening. A single sound broke the silence. The slow, deliberate click of footsteps. Keanu's blood ran cold. He didn't need to turn around. He already knew. The man in the black coat had returned. And this time, he wasn't leaving empty-handed. The hunter in the shadows. The air thickened with something ancient, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Keanu felt it before he saw him. The weight of an unseen presence pressing against his chest, the cold whisper of something watching. The man in the black coat had returned. The twin girls clung to him, their tiny fingers gripping the fabric of his jacket as if letting go would mean vanishing into the abyss. Their breaths came in short, panicked gasps, their fear vibrating through their fragile bodies. Keanu didn't move, not yet. Every muscle in his body tensed, instincts screaming at him to act, to run, but his mind sharpened instead. Assessing, calculating. He had been in fights before, been in situations where survival depended on the ability to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't a fight against flesh and blood. This was something else entirely. The footsteps stopped. Keanu turned his head slowly, forcing himself to face the figure that stood just beyond the dim glow of the streetlights. The man in the black coat was there, watching. The long folds of his coat barely moved, despite the whisper of wind that passed through the empty parking lot. His face, smooth and almost too perfect, was expressionless, except for his eyes. They were black holes, endless voids, empty of everything except hunger. A voice, though it didn't come from the man's lips, rippled through the night. sinking into Keanu's bones like a chill that would never leave. They are mine. Keanu's fingers curled into fists at his sides. His pulse thundered, but he didn't back down. He had always fought for what was right, for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He wasn't about to stop now. "They don't belong to you," he said, his voice calm but firm. The words cut through the silence, sharper than steel. The man in the black coat tilted his head slightly, as if amused. The shadows around him shifted, curling toward his body like living tendrils. Something was wrong with the space around him, as if reality itself refused to settle where he stood. Keanu could feel it. A void, a space where things disappeared. The older twin, standing beside him, whispered in a trembling voice, "Don't talk to him. Don't listen." Keanu heard her, but he didn't look away from the figure. He wasn't sure if it was courage or sheer stubbornness that kept him rooted in place, but he refused to let fear take over. He had spent his life understanding pain, suffering, and loss. And right now, he understood that this thing, thrived on fear. "You were never supposed to see," the voice murmured again, though the man's lips never moved. The words slithered through the air, pressing into Keanu's skull, whispering against his thoughts like a memory that wasn't his own. "You should not interfere." Keanu exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. "And yet, here I am." A pause, a flicker in the darkness. The man in the black coat didn't react, not in any way that made sense. He didn't breathe, didn't blink, but something in the air shifted. Keanu felt it. A crack in the tension, a realization. The man wasn't just hunting the twins. He was waiting, not for them, for him. The realization struck like a bolt of ice down his spine. This wasn't just about the girls. It had never been just about them. The twins were staring at him now, their fear momentarily replaced with something close to confusion. They had expected him to run, to leave them like all the others before him. But Keanu Reeves had never been one to turn his back on those who needed him. And he never would. His jaw tightened. "They're coming with me." The man in the black coat tilted his head again, slower this time. Keanu had the unsettling feeling that he wasn't just looking at him, he was looking through him. "You do not understand what you are keeping," the voice whispered, colder than before. "They do not belong here. And neither will you soon." The twins flinched at the words, their hands gripping his jacket even tighter. Keanu, however, refused to be moved. He squared his shoulders, exuding a presence that had made him legendary on screen. But this time, it was real. "Try me." The moment the words left his lips, the world broke. A howling wind erupted through the parking lot, despite the trees standing eerily still. The streetlights flickered violently, casting distorted shadows that twisted in unnatural ways. The pavement beneath their feet seemed to bend, shift, as if something was unraveling beneath them. Keanu felt it. The pull. A force trying to rip them away, trying to drag them somewhere they would never return from. The twins screamed. Keanu reacted. He grabbed their hands and ran. The moment his feet hit the ground, reality seemed to crackle around them, the space distorting like a shattered mirror trying to put itself back together. The further they ran, the heavier the air became. It felt like running through water, like the very world was fighting against him. But Keanu had spent years pushing through resistance, through pain, through limits that had tried to break him. He ran harder. The restaurant faded behind them, the flickering lights of the street lamps warping as if they were no longer in the same world. The shadows stretched toward them, clawing at their heels, but Keanu refused to stop. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, they broke through. The air snapped. The weight vanished, and the three of them stumbled into silence. Keanu panted, gripping the twins' hands as they all looked around. They were no longer in the parking lot. They stood in an empty alleyway, deep in the city, the distant glow of streetlights flickering in the distance. The air was normal. Everything was normal. The man in the black coat was gone. For now. Keanu looked down at the twins. They were shaking, but alive, or as alive as they could be. One of them whispered, "He'll come back." Keanu nodded, still catching his breath. "Let him." The twins looked up at him, their fear momentarily replaced with something else. Hope. For the first time since they had whispered their plea to him in that quiet McDonald's, they didn't feel alone. Keanu had a choice now. He could walk away. He could try to pretend none of this ever happened. But deep down, he already knew. He wasn't going anywhere. Because whatever was coming next, he was going to fight. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The veil between worlds. The city stretched before them, vast and indifferent, its neon glow flickering in the distant skyline. Keanu stood in the quiet alleyway, his breath still heavy, his pulse still hammering beneath his skin. The twins clung to his sides, their small hands wrapped around his, their fingers trembling from the ordeal they had barely escaped. Or had they? Keanu wasn't sure if this was an escape or just a brief pause, a stolen moment before the storm reclaimed them. He looked around. The alley was damp, littered with forgotten debris, the scent of rain lingering in the air. A single flickering street lamp buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows against the brick walls. There was no sound, no cars honking, no voices in the distance, just an eerie stillness that felt unnatural. It was as if they had stepped into a version of the city that existed just beyond the real one. A place that had no name, no history, only an endless waiting silence. The twins shifted beside him, their breathing unsteady. Keanu felt their fear, the way it clung to them like something alive, something old. He knelt down, leveling his gaze with theirs. They were children. And yet, they weren't. Their eyes carried too much knowing, too much loss, as if they had walked through centuries of suffering that no one else could see. "You okay?" Keanu asked, his voice quieter than he intended, almost afraid to disrupt whatever fragile reality they had just stumbled into. The older twin hesitated before nodding. The younger one, still gripping his sleeve, spoke in a whisper. "He's still looking." Keanu didn't doubt that. The man in the black coat hadn't disappeared. He had just stepped back into the shadows, watching, waiting. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He had no idea how he had ended up in this nightmare. 1 minute, he was just a man grabbing a late-night meal, and the next, he was standing between two lost souls and something not meant for this world. He had always believed in the unseen, in things people couldn't explain, but he had never been dragged into its depths like this. And yet here he was. "Where do we go?" Keanu asked, rising to his feet. He wasn't sure who he was asking. The twins, himself, or whatever unseen force had pulled him into this. The older twin turned her head toward the end of the alley, toward the darkness that stretched beyond. "Somewhere safe," she murmured. "But we don't know where that is." Keanu frowned. Safe. What did that even mean for them? They weren't just hiding from a person. They were hiding from something that defied all logic. A thing that walked between the cracks of reality. A thing that had already taken them once. He couldn't take them home. Where would he even take them? They weren't children in the traditional sense. They had no parents, no home, no past that still belonged to this world. He couldn't take them to the police, couldn't explain their existence without sounding insane. And even if he could, what would it change? The man in the black coat would find them. Unless... Keanu narrowed his eyes. Maybe running wasn't the answer. Maybe he needed to know what he was really up against. He looked down at the twins, his expression firm. "Tell me everything." The younger twin swallowed, glancing at her sister. The older one hesitated, then nodded. "You won't believe us." Keanu gave a small, wry smile, despite the tension curling in his gut. "Try me." The girls exchanged another glance, a silent conversation passing between them, before the older twin spoke. "He doesn't just take people," she said, her voice barely above a breath. "He takes time." Keanu frowned. Time. The younger twin nodded, her fingers twisting in the fabric of his jacket. He finds people who are lost, people no one will miss, and then he takes them away. Keanu's stomach tightened. Where? The twins looked at each other again before the older one whispered, nowhere. A shiver ran down his spine. The younger girl hesitated before adding, it's not like dying, not like being forgotten. It's like... She struggled for the words, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her dress. Like you were never here at all. Keanu exhaled slowly. Erased. That was what they were describing. A fate worse than death. His jaw tightened. That's what happened to you. The older twin nodded. A long time ago. We tried to run, but he found us. Keanu's fists clenched at his sides. Then how are you still here? For the first time, the girls looked uncertain. The older twin's voice grew softer. Because, this time, someone saw us. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. Him. That was why the man in the black coat had hesitated. That was why he hadn't taken them like before. Keanu had seen them. He had acknowledged them. He had given them something stronger than fear. He had given them presence. A connection to this world that had been lost the first time they were taken. A slow, burning realization settled over him. If acknowledging them gave them existence, then maybe, just maybe, he could fight back. But before he could say another word, the air around them shifted. The shadows lengthened, stretching unnaturally along the walls. The flickering street lamp above them buzzed erratically, the light pulsing like a dying heartbeat. Then, footsteps. Not from the street, from behind them. Keanu's body tensed. He turned, his breath freezing in his throat. At the mouth of the alley, just beyond the reach of the light, a tall figure stood, still, silent. The man in the black coat. Keanu's pulse thundered in his ears. The man had no expression, no anger, no urgency, just an unwavering stare, as if time itself had stopped in his presence. The twins gasped, their fingers tightening around Keanu's hands. He felt the air shift again. The pavement beneath his feet seemed to waver, as if they were standing on something that wasn't entirely solid anymore. Reality was bending around them, reshaping itself at the man's will. Then the voice came again. Not spoken, but inside his mind. This is not your fight. Keanu set his jaw. His grip on the twins tightened. Yeah, he said, his voice cold, steady. It is now. The man in the black coat didn't move, but something in the air around him did. The shadows at his feet twisted, stretching outward, reaching. Keanu felt the cold seep into his bones. But he wasn't running. Not this time. He had a feeling the man in the black coat had never faced someone who fought back. And tonight, that was about to change. The final stand. The shadows slithered toward them, creeping like living tendrils across the damp alley floor. The air around Keanu grew dense, pressing against his skin like unseen hands trying to pull him under. The twin girls trembled beside him, their fingers wrapped tightly around his own, their breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. And in the distance, just beyond the reach of the flickering street lamp, he stood. The man in the black coat. Still, unmoving, yet somehow closing in. Keanu didn't understand what this thing was, but he knew one thing for certain. It was not human. The way it manipulated reality, the way it hovered on the edge of existence itself, bending the rules of the world around it, it was something ancient, something that didn't belong. And it wanted them. The twins weren't just two lost souls. They were proof of something broken, something the man in the black coat had failed to erase completely. They had slipped through the cracks of whatever abyss he dragged people into. And now, with Keanu standing beside them, something was different. For the first time, the hunter had hesitated. And that meant he could be stopped. Keanu had never backed down from a fight before. He wasn't about to start now. His body tensed, his muscles coiling like a spring, ready to react. He had no weapons, no plan, just instinct and an overwhelming refusal to let this thing win. His entire life had been about fighting for something bigger than himself. He had lost loved ones, had known pain so deep it almost consumed him. But he had survived. Because survival wasn't just about endurance, it was about choice. The choice to keep going, to keep fighting, even when the world told you to surrender. And right now he chose them. The shadows moved faster, curling along the pavement like black fire, inching closer. The light above them flickered erratically, casting jagged, shifting silhouettes against the alley walls. The pressure in the air thickened, distorting sound, making everything feel warped, wrong. The city beyond the alley was still there, but it felt far away. Then the voice returned, but it wasn't just in Keanu's head this time. It was everywhere. Step aside. It was a whisper that wasn't a whisper, a command that wasn't spoken, but forced into existence. Keanu's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists. No. The shadows stilled. For the first time, the man in the black coat moved. It was slow, unnatural. His long, skeletal fingers twitched at his sides, his head tilting ever so slightly. The movement wasn't human. It was like watching something trying to be human and failing. "You do not belong in this." Keanu laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "Yeah, neither do they." He gestured at the twins, never taking his eyes off the figure. And yet here we are. A long silence stretched between them. A standstill. The hunter watching the protector. Then, without warning, the shadows lunged. Keanu moved. Instinct kicked in, his body reacting faster than thought. He shoved the twins behind him, stepping forward as the darkness crashed toward him like a tidal wave. He didn't think. He just acted. And somehow, the shadows hit a wall. Not an actual wall. Something else. Something unseen. Something that stopped them. Keanu felt it. A force pushing back. A barrier. The man in the black coat twitched. Paused. Keanu stared at his own hands, his breath sharp, uneven. He hadn't done anything. Had he? The twins gasped behind him. "You see," the older one whispered. "You can stop him." Keanu's mind raced. What the hell did that mean? He had no power, no magic, no supernatural abilities. He was just a man, but he had stopped it. He turned his gaze back to the figure standing in the darkness. The man in the black coat wasn't moving, but something had changed. His head tilted further, as if studying Keanu now, as if recalculating. "Interesting," the voice whispered. Keanu's pulse thundered. This was a test. The man in the black coat had never faced someone who resisted, which meant he wasn't invincible. Keanu stepped forward. The air shuddered. The shadows recoiled. He felt it now. The way reality bent around this thing. The way it twisted the world into something wrong, something unnatural. And he felt it pushing against him. But it wasn't stronger than him. Keanu clenched his fists, exhaling through his nose. "Not today," he said, his voice steady. "You don't win today." The twins clutched onto each other, their small hands trembling. But for the first time, they weren't looking at the man in the black coat. They were looking at Keanu. The figure remained still for a long moment. Then, he stepped backward. Keanu didn't move. He didn't break eye contact. Another step back. Then another. The air grew lighter. The pressure lifted. The street lamp above stopped flickering. The man in the black coat gave no sign of emotion. No anger. No frustration. Nothing. Then, as if reality itself swallowed him, he was gone. Just like that. Keanu exhaled. His knees nearly buckled from the sheer force of what had just happened. The twins stared at the empty space where the man had been. The older one's lip trembled. "You stopped him." Keanu shook his head, still catching his breath. "No, we stopped him." The younger twin whispered, "He won't stop." Keanu looked down at them. And for the first time, he knew what he had to do. This wasn't over. The man in the black coat would return. Maybe not tonight. maybe not even soon. But one day, he would come again. Keanu's hands rested on the twin's shoulders. Then we'll be ready. The older twin blinked, uncertainty flickering in her dark eyes. But how? Keanu looked up at the sky, at the city stretching beyond the alley, at the world that had almost forgotten these two souls. Then, with quiet determination, he said, "Because I'm not leaving you." And for the first time in what felt like forever, the twins smiled. Not in fear, but in hope. Because now, for the first time, they weren't alone.